Hello everybody, hope you're all doing well. I'm back with another video this time, talking about some of the best comics that I read this year. It's just, I meant to do it a bit earlier actually, but it's only just come round to the Christmas holidays and it's just been so busy over the last term. I work in a school as a librarian and finding the time and energy to get this done, because it usually takes me a couple hours to do one of these videos, to film it and then put it together on video editing software and then upload it. So it's sometimes a bit of an undertaking to get done. But it's now the second day of my Christmas holiday. Waiting for a test to come back negative today. And if it does, then I'll be going home for the first time since February to see my family, which has been much needed. Probably the most difficult part about lockdown has been being away from family for so long. But as I said in the last video, something that's really helped with my mental health this past year has been the amount that I've read. I was talking more specifically about novels last time, but I read a fuck ton of comics this year as well. So I thought I'd do a video today telling you about 15 comics that I read this year that really that just took my breath away. Same as last time, I'm starting off with two that almost made the cut but didn't quite. And the first of these two runner-up, shall we say, is Ram V's These Savage Shores, drawn by, what's his name, with artwork by, come on, Sumit Kumar. And I believe both of these guys are from Mumbai. I know Ram V definitely is. I can't find the author page at the moment. But if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of fantasy, this has been lauded as one of the best comics this year, or was it last year, in those genres. And I really liked it. It's basically kind of a gothic vampire story, and it starts out with a vampire basically fleeing Europe, England, and fleeing to India, where to get away from a vampire hunter. And his idea is that he's going to go and kind of, in the age of colonialism, dominate this new country that he hasn't been to before. But as he gets there, he's quick to learn that India's own mythological monsters aren't so keen to let him colonize the country once more. It's a really interesting idea and a really unique idea in a genre that so often feels tired. And I'm not usually one for reading kind of action-heavy comics these days, but this I really enjoyed, and I really hope that there's a second volume coming soon, because I feel like there's a lot more to explore. It's the first time I've read like a new kind of potential series or potential universe in comics in a very long time, and thought, you know what, I want to see more of this. I want to see the next chapter of this story. As it is, it's 6 issues long, and it's a very concept heavy book. And so I feel like in the 6 chapters, maybe it didn't get enough of a chance to explore some of those concepts fully, which is why I'd like to see more. But if we never get any more, this is a solid read and really enjoyable. I'd like to say I've also got a unique copy of this exclusive to my favourite comic shop, Close Encounters. So if you want one of these copies, contact them. I also think, not only that, but it's signed by Ram V, who's friends with the people who run the shop. So well worth the read. Really, really good stuff. My second runner-up is one I read twice this year. I actually reread it last night, and I liked it. I liked it even more on my second viewing. But again, just like These Savage Shores, I did feel that there was something a little bit missing from it. And I'm talking about the new Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips graphic novel Pulp, which is the first time that these two creators have kind of explored the Western genre. And it's not your kind of straight Western that you'd expect. It's set in the 1930s in New York, and follows this kind of aging pulp writer, Max Winter, who has who's had several heart attacks and is quite close to death. And nobody knows this, but the Western stories that he writes for pulp magazines are based on his own exploits in the Wild West. And due to his failing health, he kind of decides to pull one last heist so that he can get some money for his second wife, so that if he dies of another heart attack, she will be looked after. What really makes this worth reading, though, is there's a bit more real life depth to this story than some of the other Brubaker Phillips collaborations. They all have real life themes, but this particularly hit me during this year because it's set against the backdrop of American fascism and the rise of the Nazis in America in the 1930s. And it really captures this feeling that the world is on the brink and that all it will take is a little push and things could go very bad, which is obviously a feeling that a lot of us have been thinking about these past 2 years with Donald Trump's presidency, the rise of Nazis again in America, and of course the pandemic. So there was I saw a lot of my feelings put on this page. It is flawed in that I felt like it was the first act was a beginning, the second act was another beginning, and then the third act was a kind of quite hasty end to the book. So I would have liked to have seen it developed a bit more, and maybe another swing at the script and a bit more detail put in, maybe a bit more of a middle of a rising action arc in this. But as it is, I really enjoyed this, and as always, I'm always looking forward to what Brubaker and Phillips do next. Okay, so we're moving on to my 15 best comics that I read this year. Not all of these I have with me because one of them I borrowed from a friend, from my sister actually, and the second was one that is only available digitally. So for those ones, you'll see a little picture up, probably here, with a cover in it, with maybe some artwork featured. And the first one is one of those comics that I borrowed, and I'm talking about Chilling Adventures of Sabrina by Robert Aguirre, something, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, and the artwork is by Robert Hack, I believe. Now, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is a really fantastic horror comic, and actually, since I read it the first time, it's matured in my mind, and I keep thinking about it, and to be honest, it's probably the best horror comic I've read since Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, which is my favourite Alan Moore comic, probably. The idea of the series is it's kind of a mature reader's title that reimagines the Sabrina characters, the Greendale setting in 1960s kind of New England, and reimagines it through a much more kind of supernatural horror lens. So you can see a lot of influence from kind of classic horror films like The Omen and The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, in the storyline of Sabrina kind of coming of age and becoming a proper witch. I was surprised by how scary the comic was, to be honest. Like, there are a lot of moments which really put my back up. And, the main reason for this is Robert Hack's beautiful, beautiful artwork. I don't know if he did it digitally or by hand. I imagine it's probably a mixture of both. But the sort of almost oil painting backgrounds to the colours, to the line work is just exceptionally beautiful, and he really is able to portray that sense of dread that you think of when you think of kind of those 60s and 70s American horror classics. It reminded me a little bit of the old TV horror soap Dark Shadows, actually, in its tone, and obviously it inspired the Netflix TV series, which is pretty good. I'm not a fan of how much it changes the story because it sets it in the modern day rather than in the 1960s, and I think a lot of what gives that character to the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is that 1960s setting. But it does a mostly good job of adapting it. My biggest complaint, though, is that Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is unfinished and is looking likely that it never will be finished, unfortunately, because the writer went to write a TV show and now has a massive career in TV adapting the Archie properties with stuff like Riverdale and a few other shows. So if you're averse to reading something that is going to be unfinished, maybe skip this one. But to be honest, like, the writing and the artwork is so strong that I highly recommend everybody to read it. I was enamored by it. I was really blown away by it, and it really reinvented that kind of classic staple of characters, and kind of, along with Mark Waid's Archie comics, kind of got me a lot more interested in the Archie characters, and I might have to go back and check some of the classic stories out. But yeah, my first book of the year. Oh, but by the way, these aren't ranked by any means. These books are all in the order that I read them, so consider this list, much like the first one, unranked. So, cheers everyone. Our second graphic novel of the year, which I'd like to talk about, was one that really surprised me. It was a sequel graphic novel to a Mike Mignola book called Mr. Higgins Comes Home. Is that the name of it? Yeah, Mr. Higgins Comes Home. And we were talking about Our Encounters with Evil. Now, when I read Mr. Higgins Comes Home, I thought, like, yeah, it's pretty good. I loved Warwick Johnson-Cadwell's artwork. There's some of it in Our Encounters with Evil. I really loved the kind of unusual way that he drew faces and his kind of sense of architecture and the colour. It was really unusual for a horror comic. And there was like a real kind of hammer horror sense of humour to it as well. But Mr. Higgins left me a bit unsatisfied because I felt like it was just a one and done story. I didn't really see much reason to rank it that. It just seemed like an interesting experiment rather than a fully formed graphic novel. I ordered Our Encounters with Evil out of kind of necessity to read everything Mike Mignola's done. And so imagine my surprise when I open up the first page of it, and find out that Mike Mignola actually had no involvement in the creation of this book. Beyond the artwork on the front cover, this book is written and drawn by Warwick Johnson-Cadwell. So I felt a bit miffed at that, because I was like, I ordered this thinking this would be the next Mike Mignola book. What I got, though, was something really different from what Mike Mignola normally does, and fully exploring the sensibilities of Warwick Johnson-Cadwell. I actually thought this was a far superior book to the first one. Whereas the first one is a basically short graphic novel, this is a compilation of a few different short stories exploring the characters of Professor J.T. Meinhard and his assistant Mr. Knox as they fight evil. Therefore the title, Our Encounters with Evil. Each story is a different encounter. But this book just really, the way that it kind of re-examined classic gothic horror tropes, and it just breathed so much new life into them, and I really enjoyed the kind of sense of humour, and I don't know, I just felt like there was a bigger world to explore, you know? Like, that's one of my favourite things about the Hellboy stories, is this sense that there's this bigger universe, and every corner that you turn around, there's something new and interesting to explore. And I got that same feeling with this. So I was really surprised by how much I loved this. And to be honest, like, as soon as I finished it, I was like, fuck, I need more of this again. Like, I want to see more of this world. I want to see more of these characters. This very sort of 1960s hammer horror hokiness that's to it, but there also this kind of dark dread in the centre of it that's kind of the trademark of Mignola's work. And to be honest, I think it was better off for not having Mignola's involvement. As much as I love his talent, this feels something unique to Warwick Johnson-Cadwell as opposed to Mike Mignola, and I'd love to see more of these characters, more of these stories, and more of this world. So if you're looking for kind of a short read that's going to really knock your socks off and really make you laugh as well as cringe in fear, Our Encounters with Evil by Warwick Johnson-Cadwell, not Mike Mignola. Read this. I really, yeah, this was I'm actually talking about it now. I haven't read it since January. I think I might reread it again after this video. Okay, our next pick was something that I didn't expect to love as much as I did. Again, with like our Encounters of the Evil. I'm a big fan of the cartoonist Adrian Tomine, and I kind of ordered this because I think I've read pretty much every book-length publication that he's put out now, and I was really just gasping for something new from him because he doesn't publish that often, and I found this box set of 32 stories, the complete Optic Nerve mini comics. Now, people will know who have read Adrian Tomine that he makes the kind of ongoing series Optic Nerve, where he publishes a lot of short stories and serialized his first graphic novel. This is the kind of predecessor to that. These are short 8-12 page comics that he self-published, which got noticed by Fantagraphics and then led to the kind of more well-known ongoing series of Optic Nerve. And so this is all kind of amateur work from very early on in his career. He doesn't like most of it, but one of the things I really liked is kind of the layout of this box set, and kind of the snarky humour. So this is the introductory pamphlet, which obviously Adrian Tomine has something of a sense of humour to include this very nerdy high school photo of himself. And then inside what you have is facsimiles of each of the Optic Nerve kind of self-published comics in order, and the artwork is very rough and ready. It's not as well drawn as some of his other comics, but there's this youthful energy to it that I really appreciated. Number 2. So it was really interesting seeing his style develop in these kind of earlier comics, and you could see shadows of greatness of what was to come. And then the last 3 ones, which were more kind of professionally produced, you see his art style start to take a more formal approach, and he kind of his sense of kind of classic design, graphic design comes in. But yeah, I just really liked all of these comics. I was really surprised by how much I like them. I mean, they're kind of curiosities rather than fully formed stories, but there's just like the best of the classic Optic Nerve comics. This predecessor really kind of captures something about real life that the best of his stories do. So if you want to see a really interesting book about kind of an artist forming his style, check this out. It's also just a beautifully designed set. I really, really enjoyed opening and kind of looking at how beautifully designed this was. So very much recommended. Okay, our next book is one that has haunted me for a long time to read, and I stayed away from it in some ways because there's so much attached to it. It's a real classic. And it's also famous for being so dense, but I'm so glad that I finally kind of dived into it. I think I read the first 100 pages in 2018 when I was in Dundee studying my comics masters, and it was just too much at the time, along with university, to really kind of focus on it, so I put it away for a bit. I came back to it this year, and this is definitely one of the bleakest things I've read this year. I'm talking about Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell, illustrated by Eddie Campbell. There's no words to say what an incredible piece of work this is. I would firmly put this in my top 10 graphic novels ever now. Like, it's a masterpiece of visual storytelling, of writing, of academic study of architecture and archaeology. There was an awful film with Johnny Depp made of this, so if you've only seen the film, ignore the film and read the book because you can't compare the two. It basically is about about Jack the Ripper in London, and the murders, and it tells it from Jack the Ripper's point of view. And they theorise in this book that Jack the Ripper was a court surgeon for Queen Victoria. I don't really want to say much more because it will give away just how incredible this book is, but the amount of philosophy and thought and ideas that the two of them packed into this, there's nothing else like this, and it is a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, and Eddie Campbell's artwork is just so brilliant. It conjured up a lot of the kind of images of like Dickensian illustration that you imagine from Victorian London, but it's got this seething, ragged edge, like a serrated knife cutting through it, of realism and this real pitch black darkness. The way he draws architecture in this really informs a lot of the themes of the book, and kind of really recreates Victorian London in a way that I don't think any other comic has. It's not an easy read. I had to take frequent breaks from this because it is so bleak. The violence is so disturbing. It doesn't pull away from the violence of these murders, so if you're squeamish, maybe give this one a miss because it will upset you. But there's a lot to get out of this, and I learnt a lot reading it as well. Not just about Victorian London and Jack the Ripper, but in terms of how to use comics as an art form, as an artist. This really taught me a lot of tricks and storytelling techniques. So yeah, I don't really know what else to say about this, but fantastic read. The next comic on the list is one that I've been wanting to read for a while. I really love the writer, Alejandro Jodorowsky, and I'm talking about The Borgias by Jodorowsky and Milo Manara. And I've read a few of Milo Manara's comics now, and I've really grown to appreciate his draftsmanship and the expressions on his face. And when I learnt that this comic was fully painted in watercolors, I knew I had to check it out because the artwork is just absolutely incredible. Probably the best artwork of any comic I've read this year. As you can imagine, the comic tells the full story of the Borgias, how, you know, they Rodrigo Borgia becomes the Pope, and how they kind of really are the first massive crime family in Italy, and the way that it recreates Renaissance Italy, and this is historical fiction at its very best. I'm looking at stuff like this. It's absolutely incredible. It's incredibly adult and explicit, and not for the faint of heart with the violence. There's also a lot of very strange sex in here, which, I mean, you know, it's the Borgias. It wouldn't be the Borgias without that. But if you're looking for historical fiction, it's going to knock your socks off. The Borgias one is probably my favourite book that I've read this year. My favourite graphic novel that I've read this year. I look at the artwork and you just get swept up in the history of it and the struggles, and it's just an epic crime saga, very reminiscent of something like The Godfather, but kind of even more explicit and strange and weird. And Jodorowsky's writing is just, I don't know, he kind of reminds me of Stan Lee a little bit in that he speeds through a story really quickly, but there's so much character in every page. It really blows my socks off. So yeah, highly recommended. The next book that I'm going to talk about I actually read before Borgias, but I got mixed up in the screen that I'm reading off of here. It's a graphic novel, a European graphic novel that you can only read digitally at the moment in English, called Blue Water Lilies. Who's the writers? Let me just look this up quickly. So it's based on a novel by Michel Bussi. I'm sorry if I pronounce his names wrong. I never took French, so I don't exactly know how you pronounce these. And the script is by Fred Duval, and the artwork is by Didier Cassegrain. And basically it's a murder mystery comic set in the town of Giverny in France, which is where Monet painted his classic images of water lilies. And it kind of follows these three women. One's a young girl, one's a middle-aged woman, and the other's a woman in a twilight years, and their kind of perspective on this murder. It's based on a novel, but I can't imagine the novel being better than the graphic novel because art is so central to the theme of the book, and Cassegrain's beautiful watercolor painting really brings the setting and the artwork to life that is obviously intrinsic to your understanding of the story. It also has probably one of the best plot twists I've ever seen in anything. It just I never saw it coming, and once you read the plot twist, everything falls into place, and you re-examine the whole book, and it changes everything that came before, and how it changes how you read the story. I don't want to say much more than that because it was just a pure delight to read, and I'm really hoping that it will arrive in print at some point, because this is a book that I want to hold and pore over the artwork. As much as I enjoyed reading it digitally, this is a book that needs to be printed in English. Of course, it's available in French and English, but I don't speak French, so, you know, woe is me. But yeah, you can get it at Comixology, or you can buy it off the Europe Comics website, which is the publisher, Europe Comics. They've done a really good job of bringing a lot of kind of lesser known comics into English translation, and provided a publishing platform for a lot of books that there might not be enough interest to see print. So they're a really good publisher, and they publish so many interesting books. And I think quite a few of them have since, because of the profile that's been raised by the digital publication, have seen print publication afterwards. One of the books I'm talking about later saw print publication after an initial digital copy by Europe Comics was published. So if you've got any interest in art history, or you just want a really good murder mystery story, something like Knives Out, read Blackwater Lilies. I was just, really stunned by it. Really, really stunned. Okay, our next book, our next graphic novel that we're looking at, took me a really long time to read. It was another Jodorowsky book. I had a bit of a Jodorowsky fever after reading the Borgia, and wanted to go and rediscover some of his work. So I reread the Incal, and then for the first time, I read the spin-off of the Incal, the Metabarons, published here by Humanoids in a absolutely incredibly beautiful hardcover. What is the Metabarons? So the Metabarons are... It's all set in the universe of the Incal. You don't need to have read the Incal to read this. In fact, I think most of it's a prequel to the Incal, so don't worry about reading that if you want to just jump into this. I actually think this is superior to the Incal in many ways. The Metabarons are the kind of dynasty of the universe's greatest warriors. And you can only become a Metabaron by killing your father in Mortal Kombat, who is... your father would always be the previous Metabaron. So it's a line of these warriors. And the Metabarons graphic novel basically follows the history of 6 Metabarons, of all of them, and gives you the full history of this line of warriors. It's a lot less kind of metaphysical than the Incal, and is a lot less self-indulgent in the kind of mysticism of that book. And in that way, it's a lot easier to read, because this reads just like the very, very best space opera pulp fiction that money can buy. You'll see a lot of similarities if you've read it with Frank Herbert's Dune, because a lot of the ideas in the Metabarons came from concepts that Jodorowsky came up with when he was writing the screen version of Dune that he was supposed to direct. So there's some crossover. So if you're a fan of Dune, there's a lot to like here. And the artwork by Juan Gimenez, who unfortunately passed away of coronavirus this past year, is just absolutely incredible. It's a bit hard to look at sometimes because there's sometimes so much going on in each page, but his sense of colour, his sense of movement is just phenomenal, especially on some of these kind of double page spreads. I'll see if I can find one while we're looking at the book. But yeah, just the family history, the sense and scale and scope of the conflict is absolutely magnificent. There's so much psychology and history in this book. There's a lot of depth to the universe, and you really feel like you're watching history unfold as you're watching it, as you're reading it. I think my favourite one, I can't remember if it's his name, but Metalhead, was a fantastic character. He was my favourite Metabaron. But yeah, really recommend this. If you're looking for space opera science fiction comics, I think it's probably the best you can get. And as I said, the hardcover is just so beautiful. Jodorowsky did a sequel to this with another artist, sorry. And I'm very keen to read it after having read this. And of course, you know, it's really sad that Juan Gimenez passed away of coronavirus this year. So I actually ordered this, I think, after I read about his passing, and he was in my thoughts a lot as I was reading it. And you know, the comics world lost a titan when they lost Juan Gimenez. So yeah, really worth a read. Okay, on to our next book, which this is one of the books that Europe Comics published and has since been published in English. And I'm talking about Atar Gull by Fabien Nury and Bruno, which is an adaptation, I think, of a classic French novel. And it basically follows the story of Atar Gull, who is an African chief who follows his father's footsteps as a slave in colonial Jamaica. And the story kind of follows his struggle for freedom and revenge against the people who enslaved him. It's a really interesting examination of that period of history in colonial Jamaica, and Atar Gull as a main character is a really conflicted individual, and he's not what you imagine him to be whatsoever as you start to read it. A lot of the decisions he makes are not ones that you can sympathise with, and it's clearly a case where he does become somewhat monstrous through the brutality that he faces, and his dehumanization is quite difficult to watch, because his dehumanization dehumanizes the people around him as well. But as a study of slavery, as a study of revenge and kind of that eternal conflict between good and evil, this is one of the best I read this year. Bruno's artwork as well is phenomenal, and he does the colour palette all the way through. It was really, really incredible. It gave a lot of life to the story, and the simplification of the artwork really kind of drove home the themes of the book really well. This is one that kind of stuck in my mind a lot after I read it, and it was something that it's something that I'm really keen to reread as well, because the artwork was so phenomenal. And I'm just looking at the last page now, which is one of the most emotional last pages of a comic I've read in a very long time. I don't want to show you because it will spoil the ending for you, but yeah, this is a phenomenal graphic novel, and one of the best I read this year. I really want to read more Fabien Nury now. I believe these artists created the graphic novel The Death of Stalin that the film is based on. So yeah, again, there's a lot of historical fiction in this comic here, in this list this year. On the opposite end, we've got kind of science fiction in this next book. Again, one of the most nicely designed graphic novels that I've read in a while, and it just really turned me on to the artist of the comic, Eleanor Davis, talking about the Hard Tomorrow, which is kind of, it's a really hard story to describe because it is a bit non-narrative, and you know, it kind of sets up a lot that it doesn't follow through on, and in that way feels quite real life. But the characters really stay with you, and it's basically about a couple called Hannah and Johnny, who are social activists. In a world very similar to ours, their main concerns are global warming, the kind of racial inequality around the world, and police violence. And again, this is a book that really reflected a lot of the things that we've seen this year with Black Lives Matter movement. It really drove home the immense hope that a moment like that brings, but also the terror that the kind of pushback against it brings. And a lot of the question of the book is about these two people trying to conceive and have a baby, and the questions about, you know, what sort of future are they going to make for their child. Is it going to be a hard tomorrow, like the title suggests? I found it a really moving story, and Eleanor Davis's artwork just really puts the emotions left, right, at the front and centre. And I don't know why, but I just really love the way that she draws Hannah's nose in this. It's something about the way that she draws the big eyes with the nose that really... It's just cartooning at its very best. And the political themes are all the way through the book. I felt there was a lot that I could relate to in this feeling of like the fractured state that we live in and the terror of it, that you feel like nobody else is working to make this future, and so it falls on you to make the future that you want it to be, something more empathetic and loving and kind. And the artwork, just phenomenal cartooning. Yeah, this is a really fantastic book. And a lot, again, it's a book, the last 20 pages or so really moved me, which I won't show you because it's spoilers. So yeah, I picked this up on the strength of the cover alone. I just really loved the way that Eleanor Davis drew Hannah on the cover, and the fruit and the colours that the colour palette that she used. And, you know, frankly, part of it was, you know, the front cover having a woman wearing no makeup with unshaved armpits. I was just like, you don't see these kind of characters in comics. Comics are still a very male-dominated industry, and to see women portrayed so naturally and without this sort of sexual gaze was really fantastic. It just really gave me a lot to think about how mainstream comics depicts women in comics. So yeah, I'm definitely want to read more Eleanor Davis after reading this. I was really blown away. Okay, the next graphic novel is the second in the series, but the first that you need to read of this series. I'm talking about Hugo Pratt's classic Italian comic series, Corto Maltese, specifically The Ballad of the Salty Seas. This was, I believe this was the first Corto Maltese story that he wrote and drew, but it's the second chronologically. The first chronologically is a book called The Early Years, which I found very flawed but enjoyable. Reading this though was everything that I wanted the first book to be, and I can't wait to read more Corto Maltese. Corto Maltese is basically a sort of kind of sailor / traveller, and where is this set? This is set in the Pacific Ocean, and it basically follows him and a few other characters on this sort of Indiana Jones-esque classic kind of Jack London adventure comic. And again, these Euro Comics printings are just so beautiful. The design and the printing of these are really beautiful. And unfortunately, I think a few of these are out of print now. I think this one's still in print because it was one of the later stories that they translated for the first time. But Hugo Pratt's artwork really took me by surprise, because I think a lot of people, when they look at the artwork, will think that it's like a first draft sketch of the artwork that would be done better by another artist. But the more you get into it, the more that this very simplistic cartooning that Hugo Pratt brings, and the kind of the rough and ready brushwork and everything, it looks so handmade, and it really gives it's this propulsive energy to the narrative. And, you know, it took me a while to get used to, but the further I got in, the more I was just like, you know, you don't need to make drawing comics a complicated process. You can literally do this and draw as quickly as Hugo Pratt did, and you can get a great story. It felt like I could see the comic being made in front of me. Especially because some of the blacks, a lot of the blacks, like if you look at the inking there on the coat, a lot of the blacks are not solid. You can see the line work in it. Yeah, this is just a phenomenal story, and you know, as much as the artwork is simplistic, Hugo Pratt's composition is anything but. His design of the page and the flow of the images really is masterful, and it made me want to read a lot more of Hugo Pratt's work, especially Corto Maltese. It's also refreshingly, you know, a lot of those Jack London's kind of Robert Louis Stevenson adventure comics, adventure stories can be quite racist. And although I wouldn't say this book is free from racism, there's a lot more thought put into the portrayal of race in these stories. And I wouldn't exactly call it post-colonial, but there is a lot of revisionist kind of thought in the politics of the story, a lot more liberal thinking in the story. So yeah, I was really sucked up into this story when I was reading it. So if you're looking for a good adventure comic, man oh man, check this out. Okay, we're on to our last few comics now. So many comics, I had to put them in two piles so that they wouldn't break each other. This next book is the first part of a trilogy, but I'm kind of counting the whole trilogy in this selection. I'm still reading the third book at the moment because I had to take a bit of a break from it for personal reasons. But this is probably, if you're somebody who wants to read more about kind of black rights in America and the civil rights movement, especially in the shadow of the summer, then the March books are absolutely fundamental to that. March is a graphic novel trilogy that is an autobiography of Congressman John Lewis, who was a civil rights campaigner, activist, and one of the main leaders of the civil rights movement. It's co-written by Andrew Aiden, who I believe is a political aide of John Lewis's, and illustrated by Nate Powell, whose page composition is just phenomenal, and his kind of black and white watercolor ink wash illustrations really propel the story along. I think this has been, especially as a librarian, I've got a lot of use out of this for children specifically. You know, a lot of kids have come to me asking, is there something I can read that will help me learn about what's happened over the summer, and I've pointed this in their direction. And you know, as a history of the civil rights movement for children, it's unparalleled. Like, this would be the first thing that I think you should give a kid who wants to learn about the civil rights movement. As the book series goes on, it gets a bit more dense because there's a lot of dates and names and figures, which can be a little bit overwhelming. Even for myself as an adult, I found some of it a little bit difficult to keep up with. But the story is never anything less than engaging, and it's a real testament to John Lewis's character. And you know, again, John Lewis kind of left us this year, passed away, and I think a lot of people, myself included, felt quite lost after that, because you know, he's one of the only surviving leaders of the civil rights movement, and a lot of people look to him as a beacon of guidance and what to do, and we don't have that anymore. But you know, as with the hard tomorrow, the future is in our hands now. So this book kind of, it gave me a lot of hope, and taught me a lot about John Lewis as a person. So yeah, very powerful stuff. Okay, our next book is another Adrian Tomine comic, and I think it might be the only comic published this year that's on this list. And I'm talking about Adrian Tomine's autobiography, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist. It's his second graphic novel, because a lot of his stories are short stories, that are graphic novels that are compilations. This is the first full story, and it's basically anecdotes from his career. It's a memoir, and it kind of, there's a lot of humour in it, and again, his artwork's just so phenomenal. It's basically just about what it's like being a cartoonist and his struggles with recognition and kind of keeping a realistic perspective on his livelihood. And it was very oddly affecting at points, because Adrian Tomine is somebody who, a memoir feels like a strange idea for him to draw, because a lot of his stories obviously are about personal feelings, but he reflects those into other characters. He doesn't quite like a critical gaze, but it turns out he's the one with a critical gaze of himself. And the way that he thinks about himself and relates to himself in this story is quite relatable, because I think we all struggle with thinking that we are narcissists. And his relationship with himself is really interesting in this book. Quite emotionally affecting at points as well, which I didn't expect, because the book is so full of snide humour and snide reflection. But especially the last 30 pages, there was a lot of emotion in it unexpectedly. Yeah, it was worth the wait, but I also wish that Adrian Tomine would draw a little bit quicker so that we can get more of his books out, because I think he's probably one of the foremost cartoonists of our era. I don't say that lightly. There's a lot of fantastic cartoonists out there, but Adrian Tomine is one of the very best, and a massive inspiration to myself as an artist. I hope one day that I'm half as good as he is. So yeah, well worth reading. Okay, our next book is actually, it wasn't published as a graphic novel, but as a single issue, but it was a longer single issue, and I think this has passed a lot of people by, unfortunately, and I think Image Comics needs to republish this as soon as possible and get people reading it, because it's one of the most incredible comics I've read this year. I'm talking about Hedra by Jesse Lonergan. It's an entirely silent comic. There are no words in this, and the whole story is told visually in this kind of very geometric art style. And the story is basically about Earth has had a nuclear apocalypse, and an astronaut has been sent to find a future elsewhere, and this astronaut goes to a few different planets and sees a few different alien cultures and people, and the way that the story is told, the sort of geometric art style, is really interesting, and each page is just so incredible. The way that Jesse Lonergan forms the pages is really something special. And I felt like when I was reading this, it felt like this is the 2001: A Space Odyssey of comics, and I felt like, obviously in theme, it's quite similar to another science fiction film, Interstellar, and this is what Interstellar wants to be but isn't. I was really blown away by this, and I don't want to say too much about it because, I think it's better just to read this sometimes and let the art wash over you. But Hedra was definitely one of the best books, one of the best comics I read this year. So it's just the artwork is so phenomenal, with again that geometric style. Yeah, really worth reading. Okay, we're on our second to last book. I pre-ordered this, I think, after... Did I pre-order it, or did I just buy it when it came out? But I was really excited for this after reading These Savage Shores. It is the next graphic novel by Ram V, Blue and Green. One of my favourite covers that I've seen this year because it's so unusual. And Blue and Green is basically a kind of a jazz blues horror comic, Lovecraftian horror mixed with kind of the racial struggles of a black saxophonist, and kind of dealing with his family legacy. And then RK does the artwork, who again is from Mumbai, India, just as Ram V is. And the artwork is absolutely phenomenal, fully painted all the way through, and a really fantastic blend of digital and handmade techniques. But the sense of dread and doom that kind of lays over this story is really phenomenal. I couldn't put this down, and it really does that kind of Lovecraftian horror really well, and does a fantastic spin on a lot of those themes, because obviously Lovecraft's racial views, racial hatred, was central to the themes of his stories, and this is a really interesting example, a bit like Lovecraft Country and Ring Shout, another novel that came out this year. Does a really interesting spin on that kind of Lovecraftian horror. And it got me listening to a lot of jazz music when I was reading this, because I just really fell in love with the music again as I was reading, and the monster at the centre of the story is pretty freaky. I wouldn't say I was ever kind of terrified by it, but the character work was so strong and the sense of doom so brilliantly kind of portrayed. I really fell in love with the story. So yeah, well worth the read. Okay, our final pick is the only superhero comic that I've read this year. I've got a strange relationship with superhero comics. I feel a bit ambivalent to the stories now, unless it's a classic story that I've read. I kind of don't keep up with them anymore, and I avoided reading this for a long time because I really didn't like the artist's work in modern comics, Neil Adams. But I decided to get this after the passing of Denny O'Neil earlier this year, classic DC Comics editor and writer, particularly well known for a run on Batman with Neil Adams that modernised the character and laid the groundwork for what Frank Miller would do later. And this is his other masterpiece, Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Hard Traveling Heroes, the deluxe edition. Beautifully designed book, and I must say, Neil Adams' artwork in this was fucking phenomenal. And I actually like the artwork here a great deal more than his modern artwork. There's a bit more cartooning here without sacrificing the realism, and the artwork just breathes so effortlessly and gives so much psychology to the characters in a way that the modern artwork doesn't, because it's so hyper detailed and hyper realistic. It looks quite garish. So there's more cartooning here, which I really appreciate. But the reason why this was really acclaimed at the time was the way that Denny O'Neil brought politics into the story. It's basically Easy Rider with superheroes. Green Lantern and Green Arrow go on a cross-country voyage to discover the soul of America and kind of confront a lot of the issues that faced America at the time, which still face America today. Drug addiction, racial division and inequality, police violence, indigenous rights. Every single news item that you think could, speak to a wider disillusionment in America is confronted in these stories, often with very little tact. I must say, like, a lot of this writing didn't age particularly well in its handling of these topics, but you can recognise the historical importance of these comics, and Neil Adams' artwork again is just phenomenal. And there's a sense of writing to this that, while dealing with these heavier issues, it never sacrificed that sort of classic storytelling that you expect from superhero comics. And I really enjoyed these comics very much. The storytelling was fantastic, as much as some of the handling of the themes was left something to be desired. I was thinking, when DC are doing their kind of multiverse films at the moment, I'd love to see like a 1970s kind of serious film version of this, preferably with Chris Pine as Green Lantern. I think would be a really good casting choice. As Hal Jordan. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and it's the last comic I read this year. I'm still reading March Volume 3 at the moment, I think. But yeah, it was a good book to end the year on. So yeah, if you're looking for classic superhero comics, definitely check that out. Well, that's it for me today. I hope that you're all well and looking forward to Christmas, and are able to see some loved ones on Christmas, which has obviously become a lot more difficult with the new lockdown rules that have been announced. I won't waste your time talking about those right now, because we all have our own thoughts on them, and I'm sure yours are not too dissimilar from mine. But for now, I'm wishing you a Merry Christmas and a peaceful Christmas season and New Year. Cheers, everyone. Good old friend Jim Beam, you can always rely on him.